Craig Chandler Price was born on October 11, 1974, in Warwick, in the state of Rhode Island, United States, and had two younger brothers. His parents worked in administration at a time when it was not common for African Americans to hold this type of position. His father, John Prince, worked as a department store manager, and his mother, Shirley, was a clerk at the same establishment. It is important to note that when Craig was younger, his family lived in a city where less than 1% of the total population was African American, and given that racial tensions were still high after the civil rights movements of the 60s, the simple fact that their parents were employed and earned the necessary income to live in a relatively wealthy city speaks volumes about the kind of family they were. Craig's childhood was what most of us would consider normal. While there is no such thing as a perfect family, his came pretty close to being it. All friends, teachers, and neighbors remember that Craig was a very good-humored and apparently happy young man who liked to help others, and when someone needed help, he was the first to arrive and lived surrounded by friends. Craig never hesitated to offer his services, whether it was carrying someone's groceries into the house or mowing the lawn. It's true that things don't always look perfect from the outside. Every family has their problems, and at least once in our lives we'll all suffer from internal conflicts. But not in Craig's case, at least for a while. Around age 9, things started to change. Craig began to have thoughts that were unusual for a person his age. He started to become more withdrawn and gloomy, and would say disturbing things to his friends. The boy noticed that he could get what he wanted by threatening and hitting other people. Some speculated that these thoughts caused him to act violently. But how did such a sweet, beloved boy get out of hand? According to what some sources claim, an incident happened, and after that his personality changed forever. These sources say that police were called to an incident at his residence, but it's not clear what type of incident this was. What is known is that Craig began to have problems in the neighborhood very often. When he turned 13, the police were called to his home again. This time, the young man was accused of several crimes, such as breaking and entering, all committed in the neighborhood. Some experts argue that these accusations are indicative of a boy who is emotionally disturbed, and the image of the perfect family was gradually crumbling. No one could understand, because Greg had everything to become a good person, but threw it all away. After some time, instead of staying in line due to the latest incidents, Craig decided to join a local gang, and at that time he started doing drugs, such as LSD. LSD is a narcotic that increases feelings of anxiety and depression and distorts perceptions of reality, inducing hallucinations. LSD users tend to see images, hear sounds, and feel sensations that may seem very real to them. A troubled young African American, member of a local gang, accused of robbery and doing LSD. That wasn't an ideal combination, especially at the time. It is also reported that Craig had several panic attacks, and it was during this time that he began mixing LSD with various other synthetic drugs. Craig was already a very big person, bigger than anyone else his age at his school or in the neighborhood, measuring about 1.80 meters tall, and this began to scare other people. By this time, Craig already had a history of chasing women and enjoyed watching them through the window. He also started breaking into neighbors' homes more frequently to steal their belongings while they were away. Craig spent his nights roaming the neighborhood, lurking in the shadows and waiting for an opportunity to strike. At the end of his street lived a woman named Rebecca Spencer. She has lived in the neighborhood for 4 years with her brother and 2 small children, a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. Rebecca intended to move out of the neighborhood the following week, precisely because of her fear of the growing wave of violence in the area. On the morning of July 27, 1987, Rebecca's ex-husband went to pick up the children so she could organize the moving. After they left, she asked a friend for help. The 2 women worked tirelessly all day until 6 p.m., when Rebecca decided to cook dinner for her friend and her brother. Her brother worked nights, so he left the house around 8:30 p.m., and shortly after, her friend's boyfriend came to help them pack a few more things. After almost everything was ready, the 3 of them went out for an ice cream at 10 p.m. Around 11:30 p.m., her friend and her boyfriend dropped her off at home, and they were still talking until around midnight. After the couple left, Rebecca closed the door, took a shower, put on her pajamas and lay down on a mattress in the living room to watch some TV. It didn't take long for her to fall asleep after a long day at work. That dawn, Craig was looking for a house to rob, and through the window he saw the woman sleeping on the floor wrapped in a blanket. He went in the back door and went to the kitchen, where he intended to get a set of cookware, but changed his mind when he saw a knife on the counter. Craig went into the living room and stood watching Rebecca for a while. Suddenly, he bent down and began to strike numerous knife blows all over the woman's body. In all, there were 58 stab wounds, and when it was over, he simply got up and quietly left the house. As Rebecca was sleeping, she didn't get a chance to scream. Only the next day, when her brother returned from work, he discovered the crime. The police began looking for clues as to who could have committed such a horrible crime, but there was absolutely no evidence leading them to the killer. As a result of lack of evidence and no witnesses, the case was dismissed. After brutally murdering Rebecca in her sleep, Craig has not killed anyone else. He seemed to have calmed down for 2 years, dropped out of the gang and stopped doing drugs. During this time, he entered high school, changed school, and due to this new atmosphere in his life, Craig began to thrive in his studies and become an ordinary teenager. It looked like that sweet boy everyone knew was getting on the right track again. However, as always, Craig's desire to kill would return, and he knew he needed to find another victim. That desire was screaming. Despite trying to resist, the need reached the point where he could no longer ignore it, and in his mind, he already had the next victim. The couple Joan and John Heaton had a daughter named Jennifer, who was born in 1979. 2 years later, the couple had another daughter named Melissa. The Heaton family was close-knit and happy. But that happiness was shattered on June 19, 1983, when John decided to end his own life. In 1985, Joan began to experience financial problems, and the woman decided to move and start a new life with the girls, in a new house, in a new city. Unfortunately, they moved into the same neighborhood as Craig. On September 1st, 1989, Craig was 15 years old, and due to unhealthy desire to kill again, he got back on doing drugs, in an attempt to get the desire out of his mind. And of course, that only made the situation worse. One night, after mixing marijuana with LSD, he was walking past Joan Heaton's house. Craig stood outside watching for a while, until he decided to feed his inner monster. In the middle of the night, he entered the house through a window and went straight to the kitchen, where he found a set of knives on the counter. The ironic part of this is that Joan had bought the knife kit that very day. According to reports, when Craig walked in, he made some kind of noise that woke the woman up. She went down to check and came across Craig. Joan started screaming, and fearing that one of the neighbors would hear her, he threw himself on top of her and began to choke the woman. As soon as she stopped moving, he decided to stab her 57 times non-stop. With their mother's scream, the two sisters woke up. Jennifer was only 10 years old and Melissa was 8. They thought something had scared their mother, so they went downstairs to see what happened. As they carefully went down the stairs, Craig saw Jennifer first. He knew he couldn't just run away, so he grabbed her and started stabbing her. While being attacked, Jennifer screamed at Melissa to call the police. Jennifer suffered 62 punctures and Craig turned his attention to Melissa. The girl ran to the kitchen to get the phone, but Craig managed to reach her and began strangling her and stabbing her 37 times in a row. Not satisfied, he picked up a wooden bench and viciously hit her on the head. After the crime, he got up and saw the destruction he had caused. For some reason, he decided to cover the girls' bodies with a white sheet he found in their room, and then ran away. When the family moved into their new home, Joan used to call her parents and sister every other day, and when she didn't call or return calls, her relatives became concerned. 3 days later, Joan's mother and sister came to her house. The two women arrived a few hours later and saw the car parked in the driveway. They knocked on the door, but no one answered. The two then decided to enter through the back door and noticed that it was unlocked. Inside, the scene was horrific and the police were immediately called. It is worth remembering that Rebecca's murder had been archived, but at that moment, investigators began to believe that the two crimes had some connection. Detectives were in no doubt that they were now dealing with a serial killer, for several reasons. Number 1. Rebecca and John were single mothers living with 2 children. Number 2. Women were stabbed approximately the same number of times. Number 3. The stabbing patterns and brutal force used on both women were also nearly identical. Number 4. The murder weapon was in the victim's kitchen, although it was disposed of in an unknown location after the crime. Therefore, the police were sure that both crimes were committed by the same person. The detectives decided to call Dr. Henry Lee, the leading forensic scientist of the time, an expert in blood analysis. Another expert called in to help with the case was FBI Special Agent Craig McRae. He was able to determine that there was a highly frantic nature to the attacks, and that the suspect was displaying uncontrolled rage when committing the crimes. The information collected at the scene indicated that the author of the crimes had probably cut himself during the attack, and the local authorities began to approach several men in the region, looking for someone with bandages on their arm or hand. That person would be interrogated and would have to justify the injury. A few days later, 2 police officers were patrolling the area when they found Greg and some friends at a local park. They knew the young man very well from their past disagreements. The police decided to ask if he knew about the crime that happened in the neighborhood. At that time, he was not a suspect as authorities were looking for an adult male, but since Craig had lived in the area since childhood, they thought he might have seen something. However, the officers noticed that one of his hands was bandaged, so they asked what had happened. Craig said that one night he was walking down a nearby street, and as he was drunk, he decided to punch a car window, cutting his hand with a sharpnail. They continued to talk for a few minutes and left. Upon arriving at the station, the officers decided to check the reports from the night Craig said he punched the car window to see if his story was true. They couldn't find anything to indicate that someone had filed a report about a vandalized car. With the lack of information corroborating Craig's claims, it was clear that he had not been very candid about how he was injured. Rather than jumping to conclusions, the police decided to look into his criminal history, and his record indicated that most of the crimes he committed were for breaking and entering. Although all signs seemed to point to Craig being the suspect in the murders, the officers didn't go to their supervisors with the information right away. They questioned their suspicions because he would have been only 13 at the time Rebecca was murdered. How could a 13-year-old boy take someone's life so brutally? A short time later, one of Craig's friends called the station and told them that he had bragged about killing Rebecca and getting away with it. That information gave the officers what they needed to inform the lead investigators of the case of their suspicions. The prosecutor then issued a search warrant. In the early morning hours of September 17, 1989, Warwick authorities raided the Price family home. They turned the entire residence top to bottom in an attempt to find any physical evidence linking Craig to the murders. When he woke up to the police searching his parents' house, all he did was to go back to bed and go to sleep. Just when officers searching the house thought they would have to leave empty-handed, one of them found something intriguing. He noticed that there was a shed in the backyard that hadn't been searched yet. As the warrant covered all structures on the property, some officers went to check. After entering the shed, they located a plastic bag that had been hidden behind some objects. When they opened up the bag, they found a plethora of blood-soaked items that included knives, clothes, gloves, and other things. However, the crucial piece of evidence was the blood-soaked sock that matched Joe and Heaton's bloody footprint at the crime scene. There were no more doubts. After detectives put Craig in handcuffs and placed him in the back seat of the cruiser, they asked the mother if she wanted to accompany him to the police station. She agreed to go along, and the whole way there, all she did was cry. Craig, on the other hand, seemed totally detached from the situation. He was acting like he was just going for a drive on Sunday. As soon as the detectives got into the interrogation room, they started asking him a bunch of questions, and he confessed everything. However, he stated that he was only being arrested because he was black. What's more, the boy also said that these crimes were provoked by discrimination and that he was insulted by the victims and this led him to commit the murders. He said that the brother of his first victim, Rebecca, kept threatening him just because he played in front of their house and called him names for no reason. After he told detectives about his rage, he claimed that on both occasions he acted under the influence of LSD and that he was not responsible for his actions. Investigators know that some people make a lot of false confessions, especially if they want to impress someone. So, to determine if he was telling the truth or not, they asked him what else he remembered about the night he killed Rebecca. He stated that he remembers seeing boxes in the corner of the room. These boxes were from the victim's moving. It was then that the authorities knew they had arrested the right person. When Craig told detectives about how he had killed Rebecca, he confessed that he had killed John and her daughters and gave precise details about how he strangled and stabbed her and the girls. Craig was like a machine gun. He couldn't stop talking and gave lots of details about his crimes. When he finally finished speaking, the detectives have more than enough information to charge him with 4 first-degree murders and 2 counts of breaking and entering. On the day he was arrested, Craig had just turned 16. In 1989, it was against the law in the United States criminal justice system for prison services to incarcerate young offenders under the age of 21. So when Craig was found guilty on the murder charges, he was only sentenced to serve 5 years in a correctional facility. If he was an adult, he would have received a life sentence. Young offenders laws in 1989 ensured that after Craig served 5 years, he would be released and his criminal record cleared. While he was in the juvenile facility, Craig was required to undergo psychological therapy and tests to determine if he could be rehabilitated and return to society. However, he refused to undergo any kind of psychological treatment. Public outrage over Craig's sentence was enough for people to demand action to stop him getting out of prison after 5 years. In 1990, citizens of Rhode Island began to see changes being made to the juvenile justice system. The general attorney, several police officers, and politicians joined forces to help pass some laws that modified the penal code at the time, but unfortunately the efforts were not enough and Craig would leave prison before completing 21 years. What Craig didn't expect is that people would do anything to keep him away from society. On the same day he left the institution, he was accused of contempt and threats for saying he would kill a correctional officer by refusing to sunbathe, and because of that, he was sentenced to serve another 15 years and 8 months in prison. Craig's violent behavior only increased since he was arrested. In 1996, another 6 years were added to his sentence for biting an officer's finger. In 1997, he was again charged with contempt and made threats to a prison psychologist, receiving another 25 years in prison. Between 1999 and 2001, Craig verbally and physically assaulted another officer and received an additional 4 years to his sentence. In 2017, he attacked another inmate with an iron bar and another 25 years were added to his sentence. In all, his sentence amounts to 75 years in prison. In February 2022, Craig was eligible to apply for parole. However, to the additional sentences he received over the years, many believe he will never be released again. This case leads us to some reflections. Do you think Craig Price's criminal behavior is a result of nature or creation? Do you think an abuser who displays the same level of violence as Craig Price can be rehabilitated? Leave your opinion here in the comments. Alright folks, that's it for today. Thanks for watching until the end, best wishes, and I see you next time.